Well, as we approach the end of the month, we are approaching the end of the book. One of the pleasures and joys of going through the minor prophets is they go by a little bit quicker than the major prophets. So we're in chapter 11 of Hosea today, 14 chapters in Hosea, so we're getting close to the end. And really, what a rich book this is. So much in it. I pray that in your own individual reading, God is alerting you, pointing things out. Pray for His wisdom and pray for the illumination of His Spirit as you read through these verses. One of the things I do, I often show you my Bible. I also have a notebook here that I keep handy all the time. And what I do is when I come across something in the Bible that's perplexing, or something that I'd like to go back and study a little bit in more depth, I make a note in the book here, in my notebook, and I'll go back and when I have time, or if I happen to be preparing my own personal study or a lesson from an area I have a question in, that I go back and study it in more depth. So maybe you could do the same thing as you go through chapter 11. Start keeping a notebook of things that you'd like to go back and study in more detail. And I'm sure God will bless your individual study just as He blesses you being part of this group, a part of a group of men and women who are in His Word and looking at the minor prophets together. So today in chapter 11, a new chapter, I'm calling this God's Relentless Love. And you'll see why in just a second here. You know, we went through chapters 4 through 7 and found out about God's rejection of His people because of their faithlessness, their fickleness, their foolishness. Chapters 8 through 10, we learned about the retribution God was bringing because of their rejection of His word, because of their false, superficial worship, because of their alliances with foreign nations. So when we come to this chapter, it's kind of shocking. Look at verse 1. When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. My goodness, my son. This is the same nation that he's been talking about since chapter 4 as a nation that has gone astray from him, is going to be chastised, is going to be suffering terrible consequences, reaping the whirlwind. But although Israel has broken fellowship with him, he still refers to them as my son. Now, I know this is past tense, but you'll see as we go through there that this is continuing. So what we see in this chapter are, I think, three things. Love revealed in verses 1 through 4, love refused in verses 5 through 7, and love repeated in verses 8 through 11. Love revealed, refused, and repeated. So let's take a look at this. Verses 1 through 4. We're starting out here with a history of God's love. It's rooted in the Exodus from Egypt, and God calls them His son in Exodus 4:22. So all the words here, calling them my son, talking them out of Egypt, is taking their minds back to their history, back to where they came from, back to their roots. And that's a good practice for us as well sometimes, to just contemplate, think about, meditate on what we were like when we were first saved, and how God has sanctified us, and how God has been faithful, and how God has been good and continues to be good for us. In verse 2, note the history of Israel's resistance. He said the more they called them, the more they went from them. So the first they there are the prophets. The more the prophets called them is Israel, the more they, that second they refers to Israel, went from them. They fled the prophets. Kind of a poetic construction there, I think. But God's saying here from the very first, you are my loved son. And from the very first, you've resisted me. Fine way for a son to act, isn't it? Verses 3 and 4, we see the contrast again between Israel and God. They were rebellious. yet he was maturing them as a loving father. It's almost as if he had a strong-willed child. If you remember that book from the early 80s, The Strong-Willed Child. It's as if God had a strong-willed child and he was trying to bring them into maturity and nurture them as a loving father. He healed them when they stumbled and fell. He helped them up. When they were spiritually injured, he brought healing to them, and he led them. He freed them. It's a great picture of God caring for this rebellious nation. Verse 5, then, we see a shift. This love that's been depicted here is refused. They will not return to the land of Egypt, but to Assyria. He will be their king because they refuse to return to me. This is a terrible indictment, and it's probably as shocking as Hosea's wife Gomer. That Hosea was a faithful husband, and his faithfulness to her was returned by her unfaithfulness to him. And that's what's happening here. God's faithfulness to his people is repaid by their refusing to return to him. The result, look what's listed there in verses 6 and 7. Severe chastening with exile, with sword, and with destruction. It's almost as if God does not have a choice as a father trying to mature his son. He can't just ignore them, but he's got to respond to them proportionally. He's got to get their attention. But in case you think that perhaps God has given up on his people, that God has given up on his son, on Israel, look at verses 8 to 11, where love is repeated. His love is relentless. That's where I get the title for this chapter. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah and Zeboim? These were cities that were neighbors to Sodom and Gomorrah that were destroyed by God. How can he do that to them? He can't. He says, my heart is turned over within me. Isn't that an interesting thing for God to say? There's a doctrine that's often, I think, misunderstood called the impassibility of God. Now, the misunderstanding of that doctrine is that being impassible, God feels no emotion. He experiences no emotion. But you see here clearly that God's heart is turned over. He's all churned up. He's churned up about his people. The correct understanding of the doctrine of impassibility is not that God does not feel emotion, but that he's not driven by them. He's not a slave to his emotion. So he will execute judgment even though his heart is turned up. He will bring justice even though his heart is full of love. Verses 9 to 11 then point forward to the nation's ultimate restoration. The God will not give them up. The God who loves them will restore them. Verses 9 to 11, I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst. He's looking forward to this restoration. I think he's looking forward here to Jesus' millennial kingdom when he is on the earth. The Holy One will not come in wrath. He'll come to rule. They will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, from the land of Assyria, and I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. What he's talking about here is their restoration, that God will ultimately restore them. For now, however, we see in verse 12, they are lying to God. The house of Israel is filled with deceit. Even Judah, the southern kingdom here, is unruly and rebellious against the Holy One who is faithful. My goodness, I think when we see these verses in the Old Testament and see God's heart of love as well as his heart of justice, we should count ourselves fortunate to learn from Israel about God's relentless love for us. So what a privilege it is, brothers and sisters, to have the fullness of his revelation, all that God has revealed to us in his word. And what a joy to serve a God who not only loves us so much, but also will undoubtedly correct us when we need it. And I pray that for myself and for you as well, that the Lord find you responding and not resisting his love. I pray that the Lord finds you responding by using the gifts and abilities and talents that he has given you, that he has endowed you with, that he has equipped you with. Use those things to serve him in your local church. That's how you can express your love to the one who loves you. God bless you, brothers and sisters.